The palace wakes before the sun. Footsteps echo along endless corridors, soft as whispers, while chandeliers catch the first pale light of morning. Outside, gardens stretch in perfect lines, trimmed and disciplined, as if nature itself has been ordered to obey. Inside, silence holds its breath. This place was built to last forever, or so it believed. By the late 18th century, this glittering world had become a universe unto itself. Silk brushed against marble, mirrors reflected power back onto itself, again and again, until it seemed unbreakable. Yet beyond the gates, hunger gnawed at empty stomachs, and patience thinned like worn cloth. The distance between splendor and suffering had grown too wide to cross. Within these walls, choices were made that could never be undone. Decisions wrapped in tradition, defended by ceremony, and justified by birth alone. Each one pushed the palace further from the people it ruled, and closer to a reckoning it refused to see. Comfort became blindness. Privilege became isolation. What began as a symbol of order and divine certainty slowly turned into a gilded cage. The rulers who lived here were not monsters, but humans shaped by belief, fear, and inheritance. They could command armies, yet could not hear the warning murmurs rising outside their world. When the gates finally trembled, it was not just stone and iron under threat, but an entire idea of power. And once that idea cracked, nothing inside these walls would ever be whole again. Welcome to China, where we bring you gripping stories of wealth, ambition, and rivalry from the most powerful families in history. Here, we explore lavish palaces, ruthless decisions, and the quiet human cost hidden behind great fortunes and famous names. If you enjoy uncovering the rise and fall of old money empires, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the bell icon so you never miss an update. Join us as we uncover the legacies that shaped the world and the price paid to build them. Long before the mirrors of Versailles multiplied royal reflections into infinity, the Bourbon name carried no guarantee of glory. It began quietly, almost modestly, in the shifting landscape of medieval France, where noble blood was common, but lasting power was rare. The early Bourbons were not kings. They were landholders, cousins, and distant relations close enough to the crown to dream, yet far enough to fear being forgotten. The family traced its lineage to the ancient Capetian line, the same blood that had ruled France for centuries. This connection mattered deeply in a society obsessed with ancestry. But lineage alone did not secure authority. In the rough world of feudal politics, survival depended on loyalty, marriages, and timing. The Bourbons learned early that noble birth was not a shield. It was a test. Their estates lay far from the centers of absolute power. Life was shaped by regional rivalries, shifting alliances, and the constant threat of war. The French crown, though powerful, was not yet dominant. Great lords ruled their lands like small kings, often defying royal will. Growing up in this environment, the Bourbons developed a sharp awareness of instability. Power could be gained, but it could also vanish overnight. Religion deepened this uncertainty. France was torn by faith, especially during the 16th century, when Catholic and Protestant forces clashed violently. Belief was no longer private. It was political, dangerous, and divisive. The Bourbons found themselves at the heart of these tensions. Some family members embraced Protestantism, not only out of conviction, but also as a means of survival in a fractured nation. Faith became both shield and sword. One figure emerged from this chaos who would define the family's future: Henry IV. Born into a world of bloodshed and distrust, he was raised among soldiers and courtiers, learning early that idealism without compromise could be fatal. His youth was shaped by siege, betrayal, and constant danger. Unlike rulers raised in comfort, Henry understood fragility. He had seen crowns fall. The Bourbon identity formed around this tension between destiny and doubt. They believed in their right to rule, rooted in blood and history, yet they were keenly aware of how easily that right could be challenged. This produced a particular mindset: ambitious, flexible, and deeply pragmatic. Honor mattered, but survival mattered more. France itself reinforced these lessons. The kingdom was large, wealthy, and restless. Peasants bore heavy burdens, nobles guarded their privileges, and the monarchy struggled to impose order. The Bourbons watched this carefully. They saw that power did not come from force alone, but from appearing necessary. Stability, even imperfect, could win loyalty where fear could not. Family expectations were heavy. Children were raised to understand that they represented more than themselves. Marriage was a political act. Friendships were calculated. Education focused not just on letters and faith, but on reading people, knowing when to bend and when to stand firm. Emotional restraint became a virtue. Vulnerability was dangerous, yet this discipline came at a cost. The Bourbons learned to suppress doubt, to hide fear behind ceremony and confidence. Over time, this habit would harden into belief that they were chosen, separate, destined to rule. What began as a coping mechanism slowly turned into ideology. By the time the Bourbon name stood on the edge of the French throne, the family had already paid a price. They had survived civil war, religious hatred, and political exile. They had learned compromise, sometimes at the expense of conviction. These early struggles forged resilience but also planted the seeds of distance between ruler and ruled. The rise of the Bourbons was not inevitable. It was built on fear, calculation, and a quiet conviction that order was worth almost any cost. Long before they wore crowns, they had already chosen survival over purity, and in that choice lay both their greatest strength and the beginning of their undoing. When the Bourbon family finally stood within reach of the French crown, it was not triumph that greeted them, but a nation exhausted by bloodshed. Decades of religious war had torn France apart. Towns lay scarred, trade was broken, and trust between neighbors had collapsed. To rule such a country required more than noble-blood. It demanded a choice that would define the Bourbon legacy forever. At the center of this moment stood Henry IV, a man shaped less by certainty than by survival. His claim to the throne was legitimate, but legitimacy alone could not secure Paris, let alone the loyalty of a divided kingdom. The capital remained firmly Catholic, deeply suspicious of a Protestant king. Without Paris, there could be no France. Without compromise, there could be no crown. Henry faced a decision that was both political and deeply personal. To convert was to betray years of belief, allies, and shared sacrifice. To refuse was to condemn the nation to further war and himself to endless resistance. The choice he made was practical, calculated, and quietly devastating. He embraced Catholicism, later justifying it with a phrase that echoed across history. Paris, he said, was worth a mass. This moment marked the Bourbon family's first great success in their first irreversible compromise. The crown was secured, but the cost was invisible and lasting. Power had been won not through divine certainty, but through adaptability. The message was clear. Belief could bend in service of authority. The monarchy survived, but something more fragile was surrendered. On ce crone, Henry moved swiftly to heal the wounds of France. His most defining act was the Edict of Nantes, which granted limited religious tolerance to Protestants. It was not perfect, and it pleased no one completely, but it brought peace where force had failed. Markets reopened. Fields were planted again. For the first time in a generation, France exhaled. This stability earned Henry admiration beyond the court. He traveled the countryside, listening to grievances, presenting himself as a king of the people rather than above them. Stories spread of his simplicity, his warmth, his concern for ordinary lives. The Bourbon name, once uncertain, began to carry weight and affection. Authority was no longer just inherited, it was earned. Financial reform followed. The crown's debts were reduced, taxation was made more consistent, and corruption was restrained, if never eliminated. These measures strengthened royal power, quietly, without spectacle. They also taught the Bourbons a critical lesson. Control did not require constant force. It required systems, predictability, and the appearance of fairness. Yet beneath these successes lay unresolved tension. Henry's reign depended on balance between faiths, between nobles and crown, between mercy and authority. This balance demanded constant attention and personal judgment. It worked because he worked. The system itself remained fragile. Within the royal household, another shift was taking place. The monarchy began to see itself not merely as a political institution, but as the stabilizing center of the nation. Order flowed from the king outward. If France functioned, it was because the crown allowed it. This belief would harden in later generations, becoming absolute conviction. Henry's assassination in 1610 exposed how much depended on him alone. A single blade ended a reign that had restored peace, and with it vanished the delicate equilibrium he had maintained. His death shocked the nation on the Bourbon family. It revealed the vulnerability beneath royal success, and the danger of relying on personality rather than structure. Still, the foundation had been laid. The Bourbons were no longer outsiders or survivors. They were rulers. Their early victories proved that power could be shaped, negotiated, and secured through compromise. But this lesson carried a shadow. Each successful concession made it easier to justify the next. Over time, pragmatism would blur into entitlement. The first Bourbon triumph did not announce itself with triumphal arches or endless ceremony. It arrived quietly, through peace, reform, and acceptance. Yet hidden within it was a dangerous idea. That the crown knew better than belief, better than tradition, better than the people themselves. That idea would grow stronger with each generation. What began as a necessary choice became a guiding principle. And long before the Palace of Versailles glittered into existence, the Bourbons had already learned how to trade truth for stability, never imagining the price such trades would one day demand. After the fragile peace established under Henry IV, the Bourbon dynasty faced a question that would shape the future of France. How to ensure that stability endured beyond the strength of one man. The answer they chose would transform the monarchy from a balancing force into an absolute one. Power, they concluded, could no longer be shared. It had to be gathered, controlled, and guarded at the center. The reign of Louis XIII began under the shadow of his father's assassination. He inherited a kingdom calmer than before, yet still restless and divided. Too young to rule alone, he was surrounded by nobles eager to reclaim independence and influence. France's great families still remembered a time when kings were first among equals, not masters. The Bourbons understood that unless this memory was erased, their rule would always be contested. The decisive figure in this transformation was Cardinal Richelieu, a man whose loyalty lay not with tradition or sentiment, but with the survival of the state. Under his guidance, royal authority expanded methodically. The nobility, once semi-independent, were stripped of military power. Private armies were dismantled. Fortified castles were destroyed or brought under royal control. Resistance was not merely punished, it was made impossible. This was not tyranny and spectacle, but domination and structure. Richelieu believed that disorder, not cruelty, was the true enemy of France. To him, the crown was the only force capable of preventing chaos. The Bourbons embraced this logic. Power was no longer personal. It was institutional. Decisions flowed downward from the king, enforced by administrators loyal to Paris rather than to local lords. Religion, once a source of compromise, became a matter of control. Although religious tolerance officially remained, Protestant political power was crushed. Strongholds were dismantled, assemblies forbidden, and autonomy erased. Faith could be practiced, but authority could not be shared. The message was unmistakable. There would be one center of power, and it would not negotiate. As the state grew stronger, so did the crown's wealth. Taxation became more efficient and more burdensome. The peasantry carried the heaviest load, funding wars and administration they would never see. Successes, abroad territorial gains, military prestige strengthened the monarchy's image, but drained the nation's resources. Victory became a habit, and with it came dependence on constant expansion. At court, a new culture emerged. Access to the king meant influence, and influence meant survival. Nobles learned that obedience brought favor, while independence brought ruin. Titles and honors multiplied, binding the elite to the crown through privilege rather than trust. The monarchy no longer needed affection. It required compliance. This period marked the Bourbons' full entry into elite European society. France asserted itself as a dominant power, feared and admired in equal measure. Diplomacy replaced feudal alliance, and the king's will shaped continental politics. To the outside world, the Bourbon crown appeared unshakable. Yet, internally, a transformation was taking place that few recognized at the time. As authority centralized, distance grew. The king ruled through councils and ministers, not through direct contact with his people. Local customs were overridden by royal law. Efficiency replaced familiarity. The monarchy became abstract, present everywhere, yet felt nowhere. This abstraction fed a growing sense of inevitability. The Bourbons came to believe that their rule was not merely lawful, but necessary. France functioned because they commanded it. Disorder was proof of disobedience, not of failure. This belief insulated the crown from criticism and turned a dissent into treason. By the end of Louis XIII's reign, the foundations of absolutism were firmly set. The monarchy stood stronger than ever before, with fewer rivals and greater reach. Power had been consolidated successfully, brilliantly even, but the cost was subtle and profound. The relationship between ruler and ruled had shifted from mutual obligation to enforced hierarchy. What the Bourbons gained in control, they lost in understanding. As systems replaced people and authority replaced dialogue, the crown became less aware of the lives it governed. Decisions were made in chambers far removed from hunger, labor, and resentment. Order was maintained, but connection was quietly severed. The expansion of Bourbon power appeared, on the surface, to be an unbroken ascent. Yet beneath the stability lay a dangerous assumption that obedience could replace loyalty, and fear could replace trust. The monarchy had secured dominance, but it had also begun to rule alone without the voices that might one day have warned it of the storm ahead. The rivalry that would ultimately consume the Bourbon monarchy did not begin with foreign enemies or revolutionary crowds. It began much closer, within the kingdom itself, during a moment of fear that left a permanent mark on a young king. Power had been expanded, authority consolidated, but trust had quietly fractured. In the middle of the 17th century, France was ruled by a child. Louis XIV was barely old enough to understand the weight of the crown when violence and rebellion forced that weight upon him. The uprising known as the Fronde erupted while he was still a boy, as nobles, judges, and city leaders challenged royal authority. What had been carefully built by his father and Cardinal Richelieu suddenly appeared fragile. Paris, the traditional heart of royal power, became hostile ground. Mobs filled the streets. Armed nobles defied the crown. On more than one occasion, the royal family was forced to flee under cover of darkness. For the young king, these were not political events. They were memories of fear, humiliation, and betrayal. He learned early that the people could turn, and that nobles could not be trusted. This was the Bourbons' first direct confrontation with a truth they refused to accept. Authority imposed from above does not guarantee loyalty below. Yet rather than soften royal power, this experience hardened it. Louis did not grow to resent a sword alone. He resented proximity. Paris had seen him weak. Paris had frightened him. He would never forget that. As Louis matured, so did his resolve. He drew a clear lesson from the Fronde. Power must never be shared, and it must never be close enough to challenge. The nobility would be controlled, not through force alone, but through dependency. The people would be ruled at a distance, kept far from the body of the crown. This marked the true beginning of the rivalry, not between families, but between the monarchy and its own society. The crown no longer saw the nation as a partner in stability, but as a force to be managed, watched, and restrained. Suspicion replaced cooperation. Ceremony replaced dialogue. The first symbolic move was physical. Louis gradually withdrew from Paris, choosing instead to rule from a place he could shape entirely to his will. The court followed him, drawn by favor and fear. Nobles who once ruled their lands independently now competed for proximity to the king, mistaking access for influence. This shift altered the nature of power. Where earlier kings balanced factions, Louis intended to dominate them. Where compromise once stabilized the realm, control would now preserve it. The monarchy's relationship with its subjects became formal, distant, and absolute. Yet, beneath this transformation lay unresolved trauma. The child who had fled riots never truly left them behind. His policies were shaped as much by memory as by strategy. Versailles, still only an idea, would become both fortress and stage a place, where no uprising could reach him and no voice could surprise him. The rivalry was set. On one side stood the crown, determined never again to feel vulnerable. On the other stood a society increasingly excluded from power, burdened by decisions it did not make. Neither yet understood how deeply this divide would cut, but the first lines had been drawn, quietly and irrevocably. As Louis XIV assumed full control of the French monarchy, the rivalry between crown and society deepened, not through open conflict, but through calculated design. The king did not seek reconciliation after the Fronde. He sought prevention. Disorder would be made impossible, not by listening to grievances, but by reshaping the structure of power itself. The center of this strategy was the court. Louis transformed royal life into an elaborate performance, governed by strict rituals that defined who could approach him, speak to him, or even witness his daily routines. From the moment he woke to the moment he retired, his actions were observed, ranked, and envied. Nobles once defined by land and lineage now measured themselves by access and attention. This system appeared generous, even glamorous. Invitations to court were framed as honor. Participation in ceremonies was portrayed as privilege. In reality, it was containment. By drawing the nobility into constant competition for favor, Louis stripped them of independence. They became dependent on royal approval, too distracted by status to challenge authority. Versailles, still expanding, became the physical expression of this tension. Its endless corridors and glittering halls impressed visitors and overwhelmed residents. Everything was designed to inspire awe and obedience. The king stood at the center, radiant and untouchable, while those around him revolved endlessly, never quite close enough to matter. Outside the palace, a very different reality took shape. The cost of sustaining the court and the king's ambitions fell heavily on the population. Taxes increased steadily, especially on peasants and urban workers. Food shortages became more frequent, yet the machinery of absolutism left little room for protest. Local leaders answered to royal officials, not to their communities. Wars further intensified this strain. Louis pursued military glory relentlessly, seeking to expand France's borders and prestige. Victories brought admiration abroad, but they drained the treasury at home. Each campaign required more men, more money, and more sacrifice from those who had no voice in the decision to fight. Success became both expectation and burden. Public admiration for the monarchy still existed, but it grew increasingly distant. The king was admired as a symbol, not understood as a ruler. The rituals that sustained his image also insulated him from reality. Information reached him, filtered through courtiers and ministers, shaped by fear of displeasing him. Truth became dangerous. Within the court itself, the pressure was relentless. Nobles lived under constant observation, trapped in a cycle of performance and insecurity. A single misstep could mean exclusion, disgrace, or financial ruin. Loyalty was no longer heartfelt, it was strategic. Identity eroded as survival replaced conviction. This internal damage was subtle but profound. The nobility lost its sense of purpose beyond serving the crown. The monarchy, in turn, lost the benefit of honest counsel. What remained was a brittle harmony, impressive in appearance, fragile beneath the surface. The people, meanwhile, were increasingly alienated. They saw the splendor of Versailles, not as protection, but as mockery. Hunger sharpened resentment. Silence replaced loyalty, yet the monarchy mistook the absence of rebellion for contentment, believing that order equaled consent. The rivalry escalated without a single declaration of war. It grew through distance, routine, and misunderstanding. The crown believed it had mastered control. Society learned that it had been excluded. Each side adapted to the other's silence, unaware that silence itself was becoming dangerous. By the height of Louis XIV's reign, France appeared stable, powerful, and magnificent. But beneath the golden ceremony lay exhaustion financial, emotional, and moral. The monarchy had succeeded in dominating its rivals. Yet, in doing so, it had damaged the very bonds that once held the kingdom together. The tension did not yet explode. It settled instead, deep and enduring, waiting for a moment when ritual could no longer contain reality. And when that moment came, the distance the crown had created would prove impossible to cross. By the time Versailles reached its full splendor, it had become more than a palace. It was a machine, one designed to reshape society by redefining what acceptance, success, and belonging meant. Within its walls, status was no longer inherited alone. It was performed, displayed, and constantly judged. For the Bourbon monarchy, this system solved an old problem. For everyone else, it created a new and enduring wound. At the heart of this world stood Louis XIV, now fully formed as a Sun King. His image dominated not just France, but Europe. Artists, writers, and foreign ambassadors reinforced the myth of perfection that surrounded him. To be seen by the king, to be noticed, even briefly, became the highest form of validation. Versailles turned proximity into power. Nobles from across France abandoned their estates to live at court. Their ancestral lands, once the source of their authority, were neglected or sold to fund court life. In return, they received access carefully rationed and fiercely contested, a place at the king's table, the right to hold a candle during his evening routine, or permission to accompany him on a walk could define an entire career. This competition reshaped noble identity. Pride once rooted in service or leadership dissolved into obsession with favor. Families measured success not by governance or loyalty, but by visibility. Rivals whispered, alliances shifted, and humiliation became a tool of control. Versailles rewarded submission disguised as devotion. Publicly, this system appeared harmonious. The court glittered with elegance and refinement. Etiquette replaced violence. Conflict was contained within ritual. To observers, it seemed civilization had triumphed over chaos. But privately, the cost was severe. Nobles lived under constant pressure, aware that one mistake could erase generations of status. Anxiety became permanent. Authenticity vanished. Beyond the palace gates, this performance created a dangerous illusion. To the wider population, Versailles symbolized unity and national pride. Festivals, portraits, and ceremonies projected stability. Yet the reality of life outside the court grew harsher. Taxes increased to sustain the monarchy's image. Peasants worked longer hours for diminishing returns. Bread shortages became common. The gap between public admiration and private suffering widened steadily. The monarchy believed its image was effective because it inspired hope. The people increasingly experienced it as indifference. They admired the king, but they no longer felt protected by him. Respect persisted, but loyalty weakened. Versailles also altered how truth traveled. Information moved upward through layers of etiquette and fear. Bad news softened as it rose. Ministers competed to present favorable reports. The king, surrounded by affirmation, rarely encountered dissent. Reality became curated. This environment fostered a profound internal shift within the monarchy. Belonging at court replaced connection to the country. The king's world narrowed even as his power expanded. Decisions affecting millions were made within a social bubble governed by appearance and rank. Policy became abstract. Consequences became distant. For the nobility, acceptance came at the cost of identity. They survived by adapting to royal expectations, but in doing so, they lost the ability to represent regional interests. They became ornaments of power rather than participants in governance. When crisis later arrived, they would find themselves resented by the people and distrusted by the crown. The battle for status was not limited to nobles. Wealthy merchants and officials sought entry into elite circles, purchasing titles and offices. This blurred social boundaries, creating resentment on all sides. Old nobles felt threatened. New elites felt excluded. The monarchy benefited financially, but socially, cohesion fractured further. Public perception masked these fractures for decades. France appeared strong, orderly, and admired. Yet beneath the surface, resentment accumulated quietly. The people saw splendor funded by their labor. The nobles lived in fear of invisibility. The king ruled without challenge and without feedback. Most damaging of all was the erosion of mutual recognition. The monarchy no longer saw its subjects as partners in the nation's survival. Subjects no longer saw the monarchy as guardian of their welfare. Both continued the performance, mistaking habit for harmony. By the end of Louis XIV's reign, the battle for acceptance had been decisively won by the crown. Society had been reorganized around royal favor, but victory carried an invisible cost. Trust had been replaced by spectacle. Loyalty had been replaced by routine. And beneath the polished floors of Versailles, a quiet truth took root. The kingdom no longer felt shared. This internal damage did not announce itself with rebellion or violence. It manifested as distance, emotional, social, and moral. The monarchy stood unchallenged, yet increasingly alone. When future crises demanded unity and sacrifice, this absence of shared identity would prove fatal. By the late 18th century, the grandeur that once protected the Bourbon monarchy had become a shield full of cracks. The rituals still unfolded at Versailles. The mirrors still reflected gold and silk. But beneath the performance lay a state in quiet distress. What followed was not a sudden collapse, but a slow convergence of pressures that made conflict unavoidable. France was drowning in debt. Decades of war, court extravagancy, and administrative inefficiency had drained the treasury. Attempts at reform came too late and went too far only in theory. Those with privilege resisted change, while those without it felt the weight grow heavier. Taxation remained unequal, pressing hardest on the poor, while nobles and clergy retained exemptions that appeared increasingly unjust. At the center of this crisis stood Louis XVI, a ruler unlike his predecessors. He was conscientious, cautious, and deeply uncertain. Raised within the rigid world of Versailles, he inherited absolute power without the confidence or clarity required to wield it. He wanted to do right by his people, yet he feared decisive action. Every choice seemed to threaten balance. Every delay made matters worse. Famine intensified the strain. Poor harvests led to bread shortages, and bread was not merely food, it was survival. As prices rose, desperation spread through towns and villages. Rumors filled the gaps left by silence from the crown. Whispers of corruption, betrayal, and indifference circulated freely. Trust, already weakened, began to crumble. At the same time, new ideas gained ground. Enlightenment thinkers questioned divine right, inherited privilege, and unchecked authority. Their words did not reach everyone, but their influence was felt widely. They offered language to frustrations long endured in silence. The idea that power should answer to reason, not birth, unsettled a monarchy built on tradition. Versailles, however, remained distant. The court debated reform as abstraction. Ministers proposed financial restructuring, only to be blocked by vested interests. Each failed attempt deepened the sense that the system could not correct itself. The monarchy appeared trapped by the very structures it had created. The decision to summon the Estates General in 1789 was meant as a solution. It had not met in generations, and its revival signaled the seriousness of the crisis. Representatives from the clergy, nobility, and common people were called to advise the king on financial reform. Yet this act, intended to stabilize the monarchy, instead exposed its fragility. Expectations collided. The common representatives arrived burdened with grievances and hope. They believed they were finally being heard. The privileged orders arrived determined to preserve their status. The crown stood between them, uncertain, indecisive, and increasingly irrelevant. Versailles became the stage for a gathering it could no longer control. Procedure replaced progress. Debate hardened into division. The king hesitated, issuing half measures that satisfied no one. Each delay fueled suspicion. Each compromise weakened authority. What had once been distance now became danger. The separation between ruler and ruled collapsed into confrontation. The people no longer waited for protection. They demanded accountability. The monarchy, long accustomed to obedience, struggled to respond. The build-up to conflict was not marked by one fatal error, but by many small failures, missed chances, delayed reforms, and misplaced faith in tradition. The system had functioned for generations, but it could not bend fast enough to survive this moment. As tension thickened the air at Versailles, it became clear that the coming clash would not be between armies, but between ideas. Absolute authority faced popular expectation. Ritual faced reality. And once that confrontation began, there would be no returning to the world that had existed before. The confrontation did not arrive with a single declaration or a formal battle. It emerged through confusion, anger, and a growing sense that the old rules no longer applied. What began as debate within Versailles soon spilled beyond its gates, where hunger and hope had already turned patience into resolve. Inside the Estates General, disagreement hardened into defiance. The representatives of the common people, frustrated by procedure and exclusion, declared themselves a national assembly. They claimed the right to speak for the nation itself, not merely to advise the crown. This was more than a political maneuver, it was a direct challenge to absolute authority. Sovereignty, they argued, did not belong solely to the king. Louis XVI hesitated. He could have suppressed the assembly by force, but feared bloodshed. He could have embraced reform fully, but feared losing control. Instead, he delayed. Troops gathered near Paris, intended as reassurance, yet interpreted as threat. Each attempt to maintain order only deepened suspicion. Outside the palace, tension exploded. On 14 July 1789, crowds stormed the Bastille, a fortress prison that symbolized royal authority more than actual power. Its fall was militarily insignificant, but emotionally decisive. The people had acted without permission and succeeded. For the first time, the monarchy realized it could no longer rely on fear alone. News of the Bastille's fall reached Versailles quickly. The court was stunned. The king was informed that Paris was no longer under control. Authority, once assumed to be permanent, suddenly felt fragile. Advisors urged firmness. Others urged compromise. No path seemed safe. As unrest spread, the monarchy's isolation became undeniable. Provincial revolts erupted. Feudal privileges were attacked. Symbols of noble authority were destroyed. What had been controlled from the center now fractured across the nation. The crown issued proclamations, but their power diminished with each passing day. The most dramatic confrontation came in October, when thousands marched from Paris to Versailles. Women led the procession, driven by hunger and anger. They demanded bread, justice, and the king's presence in the capital. Versailles, designed to keep danger at a distance, now faced it directly. The palace was breached. Guards were killed. Royal apartments were invaded. The spectacle of untouchable power dissolved into chaos and fear. For the first time, the monarchy was physically confronted by the people it ruled. The illusion of divine separation collapsed. Forcé to act, the king agreed to move his family to Paris. This journey marked a turning point. The monarch was no longer the distant center of authority, but a visible captive of popular will. The crowd followed, chanting triumphantly. What appeared as protection was, in truth, control. In Paris, the royal family lived under constant surveillance. Every action was scrutinized. Respect gave way to suspicion. Attempts at reform were met with distrust. The king's indecision, once tolerable within ceremony, now appeared as weakness. The monarchy's final mistake came with an attempt to escape. Hoping to regain freedom and rally support, the royal family fled Paris in disguise. They were recognized, arrested, and returned in humiliation. Any remaining belief in the king's loyalty to the nation evaporated. From that moment, reconciliation became impossible. Trust, once strained, was broken entirely. The monarchy was no longer seen as misguided, but as hostile. Power shifted decisively away from the crown and towards revolutionary authority. The confrontation had reached its peak not through a single battle, but through accumulated loss of legitimacy. The monarchy had not been overthrown yet, but it had been exposed. It was no longer sacred, no longer distant, no longer unquestionable. What remained was a hollow shell of authority, surrounded by suspicion and resentment. The balance that had sustained Bourbon rule for centuries was gone, and in its place stood a nation unwilling to return to silence, and a crown unable to command obedience. After the failed escape and forced return to Paris, the fate of the Bourbon monarchy entered a new and irreversible phase. What had once been a crisis of authority became a crisis of existence. The crown was no longer merely weakened, it was fundamentally questioned. Every action taken by the monarchy was now interpreted through suspicion, and every silence was filled with accusation. The king, Louis XVI, was stripped of the distance that had once defined his power. Confined with his family, he lived under constant watch, his movements regulated, his words dissected. The rituals of monarchy, once essential to maintaining authority, were gone. Without ceremony, the king appeared ordinary, uncertain, and exposed. Revolutionary institutions grew stronger as royal power diminished. Laws were passed that reduced the monarchy to a constitutional role. But even this compromise satisfied no one. Two radicals. The king represented betrayal and tyranny. Two moderates. He symbolized a fragile stability that might yet preserve order. To the monarchy itself, these reforms felt like erosion rather than renewal. The political climate hardened rapidly. War with foreign powers intensified fears of internal treachery. The king's earlier correspondence with foreign monarchs was revealed, confirming the worst suspicions of his critics. Whether these actions were desperate attempts at survival or calculated betrayal mattered little. Perception became reality. Public opinion turned sharply. The language of loyalty was replaced by the language of justice. Pamphlets and speeches portrayed the king not as a flawed ruler, but as an enemy of the nation. His identity shifted from sovereign to suspect. This transformation was psychological as much as political. The monarchy's last claim that it existed for the good of France collapsed under this weight. Revolutionary leaders argued that the nation could not be free while the king lived as a symbol of the old order. His very presence was seen as a threat to the future. The question was no longer whether the monarchy should rule, but whether it should exist at all. The trial of the king was a defining moment. For the first time in French history, a reigning monarch was judged by representatives of the people. The proceedings were heavy with symbolism. Louis was addressed not as king, but as citizen. Titles vanished. Tradition offered no protection. The charges centered on betrayal, conspiracy, and resistance to the will of the nation. The king defended himself calmly, insisting on his good intentions and loyalty to France. Yet intention no longer mattered. The trial was not simply about guilt, was about closing a chapter of history. The verdict was death. On the day of execution, the former king walked to the scaffold before a silent crowd. He attempted to speak, to explain, perhaps to reconcile, but his words were drowned out. The blade fell quickly. With it ended not only a life, but an idea that had governed France for centuries. The immediate aftermath was shock. Europe recoiled. Monarchies across the continent trembled at the implication that kings could be judged and killed by their subjects. France itself entered a period of violence and uncertainty. The fall of the monarchy did not bring peace. It unleashed forces that could not be easily controlled. For the Bourbon family, the consequences were devastating. Some fled into exile, stripped of power and identity. Others met violent ends. The network of privilege that had once sustained them vanished almost overnight. Names that once commanded obedience became liabilities. Versailles, the heart of royal life, was abandoned. Its halls fell silent. Its purpose erased. What had been designed as an eternal symbol of order now stood as a relic of a world that no longer existed. The palace survived, but the power it embodied did not. Long term, the execution marked a point of no return. The sacred bond between ruler and ruled was severed completely. No restoration could ever fully repair it. Even when the monarchy would later return in altered form, it would do so without its former certainty or authority. The consequences extended beyond France. The execution challenged the very foundation of hereditary power across Europe. It proved that legitimacy could be withdrawn, that tradition could be overturned, and that authority without trust was fragile. For the people of France, the aftermath was complex. Some felt triumph, others dread. The monarchy had fallen, but the future was uncertain. Freedom came entangled with fear, sacrifice, and instability. The revolution devoured its own ideals as often as it defended them. In the end, the Bourbon monarchy did not fall because of one decision, one famine, or one uprising. It fell because it could not adapt without losing itself. The system it had built was too rigid to bend, and too distant to understand the moment it faced. The consequences were absolute. Power, once absolute, was gone. What remained was memory, symbol, and warning. And from that point onward, nothing, neither crown nor country, would ever return to what it had been before. With the execution of Louis XVI, the Bourbon monarchy ceased to exist as a governing force, but it did not disappear from history. What followed was not a clean ending, but a long reckoning, one marked by exile, memory, and unresolved grief. The final battles of the Bourbons were no longer fought with armies or decrees, but within identity itself. Those members of the royal family who survived fled France, carrying titles that no longer held meaning. In foreign courts, they were received with sympathy, curiosity, or caution. They were reminders of a world that had collapsed. Once treated as living symbols of divine order, they were now dependent on hospitality and nostalgia. Power had been replaced by memory. In exile, reflection became unavoidable. The certainty that had sustained generations of Bourbon rule dissolved into questions that could no longer be ignored. Had authority been mistaken for loyalty? Had order been valued over justice? These were not debates held publicly, but private reckonings carried in silence. The habits of command lingered, even when there was no one left to command. Within France, the revolution turned inward. The fall of the monarchy did not bring immediate peace. Factions battled for control. Ideals hardened into dogma, and violence escalated. The king's death had removed a symbol, but it had not resolved the tensions that led to his fall. In this, some began to look back on the monarchy with conflicted emotions, resentment, mixed with regret. The Bourbon name became both curse and comfort. Two revolutionaries. It represented oppression and inequality. Two moderates and conservatives. It symbolized stability lost too violently. The family itself was caught between these interpretations, unable to control how its legacy was used or remembered. Internally, the Bourbons faced a quieter struggle. The loss of purpose. Their identity had been built entirely around rule. Without a throne, tradition offered no guidance. Adaptation was painful and uneven. Some clung to the hope of restoration. Others retreated into obscurity, reshaping themselves as private individuals for the first time in generations. Attempts at restoration would come later, but they lacked the force of inevitability that once defined Bourbon power. The monarchy could return in name, but not in spirit. The illusion of divine right had been shattered too publicly, too completely. Authority could no longer be assumed, it had to be justified. The final battle, then, was not for France, but for meaning. The Bourbons had to confront the truth that their greatest strength, absolute certainty, had also been their greatest weakness. Their refusal to share power, to listen, or to evolve beyond control had secured their dominance, but ensured their isolation. This period of reflection marked the true end of the Bourbon era, not with the fall of a blade, but with the recognition that the world had changed in ways they could not reverse. History had moved forward, carrying their legacy with it, but leaving their authority behind. What remained was not victory or defeat, but consequence. The Bourbons had built one of the most powerful monarchies Europe had ever known. In the end, they were left to reckon with what that power had cost and what it had failed to protect. When the Bourbon monarchy fell, its power vanished almost overnight, but its symbols did not. Stone, gold, and memory proved far more durable than authority. Across France, and especially within Palace of Versailles, the physical remains of Bourbon rule continued to shape how the past was remembered, debated, and contested. These monuments became battlegrounds of meaning, where public memory clashed with private truth. Versailles, once the beating heart of absolute monarchy, survived the revolution not as a seat of power, but as a question. Its vast halls, designed to overwhelm and instruct, stood emptied of their original purpose. The mirrors still reflected light. The gardens still obeyed geometry, yet the certainty that had animated them was gone. What remained was beauty stripped of authority. For revolutionaries, Versailles represented excess and injustice. It was proof of how far the monarchy had removed itself from the lives it governed. For others, it was an architectural triumph, a testament to French artistry and ambition. These conflicting interpretations existed side by side, revealing how symbols can outlive the intentions that created them. The transformation of Versailles into a museum was itself symbolic. Once reserved for the few, it was open to the many. Spaces designed to control access now invited observation. Power was replaced by education, reverence by curiosity. The palace became a place to look at history, rather than live within it. Yet, museums are selective. They present narratives shaped by choice. Portraits of kings and queens remained on the walls, but their authority was reduced to context. Objects once imbued with command became artifacts: crowns, thrones, and ceremonial garments. No longer ordered obedience, they invited reflection. Other symbols endured beyond stone: titles, names, and traditions lingered in language and culture. Streets and regions still bore marks of royal favor. The very idea of France as a unified, centralized state owed much to Bourbon governance. Even in rejection, the revolution inherited structures the monarchy had built. Public ceremonies replaced royal ritual. National festivals, civic oaths, and revolutionary calendars attempted to reshape collective identity. These new traditions borrowed heavily from the spectacle they sought to replace. Processions, symbolism, and performance remained essential tools of authority. The lesson of Versailles that power required display was not forgotten, merely reinterpreted. For the Bourbon family, these enduring symbols were painful reminders. To see their former world preserved, studied, and sometimes admired, while they lived without influence, was a quiet cruelty. Their legacy was no longer theirs to shape. It belonged to historians, politicians, and the public imagination. The contrast between public memory and private truths grew sharper over time. In popular culture, the Bourbons became characters, icons of decadence or tragedy, depending on the storyteller. Their individual doubts, fears, and compromises were often lost beneath broad judgment. Human complexity was flattened into moral lesson. Yet some symbols resisted simplification. The image of the executed king, come yet defeated, lingered as a warning about the limits of authority. The deserted palace stood as a reminder that grandeur cannot secure loyalty. These moments endured because they spoke to universal themes: power, isolation, and consequence. Internationally, the fall of the Bourbons reshaped political imagination. Monarchs across Europe altered rituals, strengthened alliances, or cautiously reformed, aware that symbols alone could no longer protect them. The execution of a king had turned tradition into vulnerability. In France, memory continued to evolve. Later generations debated whether the monarchy had been necessary, cruel, or merely outdated. Restorations attempted to revive royal imagery, but without its former weight. Crowns returned briefly, yet they rested uneasily, aware of their fragility. Versailles itself became a stage once more not for kings, but for history. Treaties were signed. Visitors walked its halls, aware that they stood inside a cautionary tale. The palace no longer commanded silence, it invited interpretation. What endured most powerfully was the lesson embedded in these monuments. They demonstrated that authority built on distance can achieve control, but not connection. That spectacle can inspire awe, but also resentment, and that symbols, however grand, cannot adapt on their own. The Bourbons had believed their monuments would secure their legacy. In truth, those same structures outlived them as evidence of both achievement and failure. Stone preserved what power could not. In this way, the enduring symbols of Bourbon rule became mirrors of history itself. They reflected not certainty, but contradiction, not victory, but complexity. And they ensured that the fall of French royalty would never be forgotten, only reinterpreted, generation after generation. The fall of the Bourbon monarchy did not end its story immediately. History, rarely decisive, offered the family a brief and uneasy return. Yet this return revealed a final truth. Power, once broken, cannot be restored in its original form. What followed was not revival, but gradual fading. After years of revolution, war, and empire, France turned once more to the familiar name of Bourbon. The restoration of the monarchy brought Louis XVIII to the throne, a ruler shaped more by exile than command. He returned not as an absolute monarch, but as a constitutional one, bound by charters, assemblies, and public expectation. The crown still existed, but it no longer stood above the nation. This restored monarchy faced an impossible task. It had to symbolize continuity without reviving resentment. It had to govern without commanding. Every gesture was scrutinized. Every decision was haunted by memory. The past was not distant enough to forget, nor close enough to reclaim. The Bourbons attempted adaptation. Laws were tempered, rituals soft-knit. Authority was presented as moderation rather than dominance. Yet the monarchy struggled to define its purpose in a world that had learned to question it. The illusion of inevitability was gone. Rule now depended on consent, a language the dynasty had never fully learned to speak. The reign of Charles exposed this weakness clearly. More rigid in belief, he attempted to reassert traditional authority, restoring privileges and strengthening the church. These efforts were meant to reclaim dignity, but instead revived fear. The nation responded not with loyalty, but resistance. In 1830, the monarchy fell once again. This time, there was no execution, no revolutionary terror, only rejection. Charles X went into exile quietly, a king without a kingdom. His departure met with relief rather than outrage. The Bourbons did not fall in flames. They faded into a... This second fall carried a deeper finality. It confirmed that the monarchy no longer belonged to the future of France. Restoration had not healed the wound left by revolution. It had merely revealed its permanence. The crown could survive symbolically, but not politically. For the Bourbon family, survival meant adaptation on a personal level. Titles became historical footnotes. Influence became social rather than political. The dynasty endured in lineage, but not in power. Their presence in history shifted from command to commentary. What had been lost was not merely authority, but confidence. The Bourbons could no longer assume that their role was necessary. They had to justify their existence in a world that had moved beyond inherited certainty. This was a loss no decree could reverse. France itself continued forward, shaped by republican ideals, empire, and reform. Yet traces of Bourbon governance remained embedded in its institutions' centralization, bureaucracy, and national identity. The monarchy vanished, but its imprint endured. The final outcome of the Bourbon dynasty was not extinction, but transformation into memory. They became part of France's past, rather than its present. Their story shifted from living power to historical lesson. In the end, the Bourbons survived biologically, architecturally, and culturally, but not politically. Their decline was complete, not when they were overthrown, but when they were no longer feared, desired, or believed in. They had built an empire on certainty. They lost it to doubt. The story of the Bourbons is not simply one of rise and fall. It is the story of how power is built, protected, and ultimately undone by the very methods that once made it strong. They inherited a fractured kingdom and forged it into a centralized state. They replaced chaos with order, uncertainty with structure, and rivalry with obedience. In doing so, they created one of the most formidable monarchies Europe had ever known. What they won was immense. Stability followed civil war. France became a dominant cultural and political force. Art, architecture, and administration flourished under royal command. For generations, the crown stood as the unquestioned center of national life. The Bourbons did not merely rule France, they defined it. But what they lost was harder to see and far more costly. In choosing control over connection, the monarchy slowly severed itself from the people it governed. Ritual replaced dialogue. Distance replaced trust. The splendor of Versailles, designed to secure authority, became a wall that filtered out truth. By the time hunger, debt, and new ideas demanded response, the crown could no longer hear clearly nor act decisively. The ultimate tragedy of the Bourbons was not cruelty, but certainty. They believed too deeply in the permanence of their role. Compromise had once saved them, but absolutism convinced them they no longer needed it. Power became identity, and when power was challenged, identity collapsed with it. What endured were the symbols, palaces, portraits, and memory. What did not endure was legitimacy. Once lost, it could not be restored, not by force, not by tradition, not be retorn. The monarchy came back briefly in name, but never again in spirit. The Bourbons gained a kingdom, but lost the bond that made it sustainable. They secured obedience, but sacrificed loyalty. And when the moment came that required trust, patience, and shared sacrifice, there was nothing left to draw upon. History remembers their victories in stone and ceremony, but beneath that grandeur lies a quieter lesson. Power can command, but it cannot replace understanding. Authority can enforce order, but it cannot survive without belief. In the end, the Bourbons did not lose everything. Their legacy still shapes France. Yet the one thing they could not keep, the one thing no empire can reclaim once broken, was the confidence of the people. And without that, even the greatest throne becomes just a chair, left behind in an empty room.